You had breakfast this morning. Maybe it was toast, maybe eggs. Maybe you grabbed something and ate it standing over the sink, half awake, not really thinking about it. Breakfast is so automatic, so built into the rhythm of the day, that most of us never stop to ask, where did it come from? Not the food itself, but the idea of it. The first meal, the thing you eat when you wake up, because 10,000 years ago, someone woke up too. They opened their eyes, they were hungry, and what they did next was completely, fascinatingly different from anything in your kitchen. This is what breakfast looked like at the dawn of human civilization. First, let's set the scene. 10,000 years ago is not ancient history in the way we usually mean it. There were no pyramids yet, no Roman Empire, no writing, no wheels, no cities. The world's population was somewhere between 5 and 10 million people, less than the population of London today, scattered across every continent, living in small groups, moving with the seasons, eating whatever they could find or catch or dig up. But here's what's important. 10,000 years ago is also almost exactly the moment everything changed. This is the cusp of what historians call the Neolithic Revolution, the point at which humans began, in certain parts of the world, to stop following their food and start growing it. So depending on where you were born in that world, breakfast looked radically different. We're going to look at both worlds, the last of the hunter-gatherers and the first of the farmers, because the contrast between them is one of the most interesting stories in all of human history. Let's start with the hunter-gatherers, the people living the way humans had always lived, moving, foraging, hunting, following animals and seasons across the landscape. For them, the concept of breakfast as a separate, scheduled meal probably didn't exist the way it does for us. There were no clocks, there were no fixed meal times. You ate when you had food, when your body demanded it, or when the opportunity presented itself. Hunger was the only alarm. But when they did eat in the morning, and the evidence suggests they often did, since the body's energy is lowest after a night of fasting, what was available? The answer depends heavily on the season and the region, but across multiple archaeological sites, from Europe to the Middle East to Africa, researchers have pieced together a picture. Wild plant foods were the foundation of almost every morning meal. We know this not from written records, there are none, but from the physical evidence left behind. Grinding stones worn smooth from hours of use, dental plaque calcified on the teeth of ancient skulls, which still contains microscopic starch grains that can be identified by species. Charred food remains in ancient fireplaces, some of them still recognizable under a scanning electron microscope. And what those sources tell us is this: acorns were enormous, not just occasionally eaten. Archaeologists believe acorns may have been one of the single most important calorie sources for hunter-gatherers across large parts of Europe, Asia, and North America. They're dense, storable, and grow in massive quantities. The problem is that raw acorns are bitter and mildly toxic, full of tannins, so people learn to process them, cracking the shells, grinding the nuts into a coarse flour on flat stones, then leaching the flour with water repeatedly to wash the bitterness out. The result was a bland, beige paste or a thick porridge-like substance. Not delicious, but filling, and it could keep you going all morning. Wild grasses were also on the menu, and earlier than most people realize. Researchers have found evidence that humans were grinding wild wheat and barley into something resembling flour as long as 23,000 years ago. That is not a typo. 23,000 years ago, long before agriculture, long before civilization, someone was crouching over a flat stone in what is now Israel, grinding wild grass seeds into a rough powder. By 10,000 years ago, this practice was widespread across the Middle East. Ground wild grain, cooked over a fire with water, made a thick porridge. It wasn't pretty. The grain hadn't been domesticated yet, so the seeds were smaller, harder, and tougher than anything you'd recognize as wheat today. The porridge was gritty. Archaeologists examining ancient teeth have found heavy wear consistent with a lifetime of eating food full of tiny stone particles, fragments of the grinding stones that made it into the meal. Ancient breakfast came with a side of gravel. Now here's the part that tends to surprise people. In 2018, a team of archaeologists from the University of Copenhagen, University College London, and Cambridge made a discovery in northeastern Jordan that rewrote one of the most basic things we thought we knew about food. They found bread, real bread, charred fragments of flatbread baked in a stone fireplace at a site called Shubaika 1. and dated to 14,400 years ago, 4,000 years before agriculture, 4,000 years before anyone had planted a single crop. Hunter-gatherers, people with no farms and no permanent settlements, were baking bread. It was made from wild einkorn, a primitive ancestor of wheat, ground into flour, mixed with water, possibly with some wild plant tubers added in, and cooked directly on hot stones or in the embers of a fire. It would have been flat, dense, unleavened, and probably pretty rough in texture. Nothing like a modern loaf, closer to a very thick, chewy cracker, but bread. Actual bread, made and eaten before agriculture even existed. The researchers believe that making this kind of flatbread, which was labor-intensive, requiring gathering, processing, and cooking, may actually have been one of the things that encouraged people to eventually start farming. Once you've discovered how good a hot piece of bread tastes in the morning, you start thinking about how to make sure the grain is always there. Breakfast, in other words, may have helped invent agriculture. Beyond grain, the morning foragers' options depended entirely on the landscape around them. If you were near water, you might have fish, roasted quickly on a hot stone, or simply eaten raw if the fire hadn't been rekindled from the night before. We know ancient humans ate enormous quantities of fish from the fish bones found at nearly every riverside and coastal site ever excavated. If it was summer or autumn, wild berries and fruits were available. Blackberries, raspberries, wild plums, crab apples, figs. These don't preserve well archaeologically, but their seeds do, and those seeds show up everywhere. Sweet, easy, no preparation needed. The closest thing to a prehistoric fast food. Honey was precious. Bees existed long before humans did, and ancient people understood perfectly well what a beehive meant. Rock paintings in Spain, dating to around 8,000 years ago, show humans climbing ropes to reach hives high on cliff faces. The earliest honey hunters risked falls and stings for the same reason you'd pay 3 times the normal price for a good jar of honey. It's extraordinary. Sweet things were rare in this world. When you found them, you ate them. Insects were food. This one makes modern Western audiences uncomfortable, but the evidence is clear. And the logic is undeniable. Insects are extraordinarily nutritious, more calorie dense per gram than most meat, and vastly easier to catch. Grubs found under bark, beetles, caterpillars, locusts when they swarmed. The Hadza people of Tanzania, who today live a lifestyle closely resembling that of pre-agricultural hunter-gatherers, eat insects regularly and consider certain grubs a delicacy. 10,000 years ago, most humans would have agreed, and meat, when there was meat. Hunting is not reliable. Hunters fail far more often than they succeed, and a large animal might only be caught every few days or every few weeks. When there was meat, it was usually cooked over a fire, and the most calorie-dense parts, the organs, the marrow inside the bones, were prioritized. Cracking open a femur bone to access the rich, fatty marrow inside was considered valuable enough that humans were doing it at least 2 million years ago. A piece of roasted bone marrow, eaten first thing in the morning after a successful hunt the night before, was one of the richest breakfasts available in the ancient world. Now let's cross to the other side of that great historical divide. The first farmers, by 10,000 years ago, in the region we now call the Fertile Crescent, modern-day Iraq, Syria, Turkey, Lebanon, Israel, and Jordan. Some human communities had begun the extraordinary experiment of agriculture. They had noticed that certain grasses grew better near their campsites, probably because discarded seeds had sprouted there. And slowly, generation by generation, they had begun to deliberately plant, tend, and harvest. For these first farmers, breakfast was more predictable, but in some ways, considerably less interesting. The staple crop was emmer wheat, or einkorn wheat, or barley, depending on the region. These were ground into flour, the same grinding stone process, but now with domesticated grain that had been selectively bred over generations to have larger, more accessible seeds. The flour was made into flatbreads, cooked on a hearthstone, or it was boiled into a thick porridge, sometimes with a handful of dried legumes, lentils, peas, or chickpeas, added in for protein. This is roughly the same breakfast that the majority of humanity would eat for the next 8,000 years. Porridge and flatbread, over and over, every morning, generation after generation. It was reliable, it was storable, it could feed a family through winter, and it was deeply, profoundly boring compared to the varied, seasonal, opportunistic diet of the hunter-gatherers who came before. This is one of the most counterintuitive facts in all of archaeology. Farming made the diet worse, at least initially. The hunter-gatherers ate a wide variety of foods and were generally well-nourished. The first farmers ate mostly grain, and the evidence from their skeletons shows it reduced height, more tooth decay, more signs of nutritional deficiency. The Neolithic Revolution was one of the most important turning points in human history, and for the people living through it, it came with a significantly blander breakfast. So what does all of this actually tell us? It tells us that the hunger you feel in the morning is exactly the same hunger that a person felt standing at the edge of a forest 10,000 years ago. The same mechanism, the same biological urgency. The body has not changed. What changed was the world around that body, the options available, the knowledge of what was edible and how to prepare it, the tools, a grinding stone instead of a toaster, a hearthstone instead of a hob, the person crouching over a fire in 8000 BC eating a piece of rough flatbread with their hands was not primitive. They were resourceful. They had figured out without any instruction or any book that wild grain seeds could be gathered, ground, mixed with water, and cooked into something that kept them alive and satisfied. They had invented bread from scratch. Literally, the acorn porridge, the roasted fish, the stolen mouthful of wild honey, the grub found under a piece of bark, the gritty flatbread cooked on a stone. None of it sounds appealing by modern standards, but every single one of those foods was the result of accumulated human knowledge, passed down across hundreds of generations about how to feed yourself in a world that didn't come pre-packaged. The next time breakfast feels like a chore, think about the first person who figured out how to make it. They had no recipe, no kitchen, no guarantee there would be food tomorrow, and somehow every morning they found a way. If you found this interesting, the small human everyday side of ancient history, subscribe!